Environmental changes. Today we're going to explore how short and long-term environmental changes affect organisms and traits in subsequent populations. Your starter. Fish in a lake have to compete for space. Different fish have different optimal temperature ranges. The graph below shows the temperature ranges of 4 fish species. At which temperature range will there be the most competition for space among these fish species? So, what you want to do is really look at your answer choices and go through them and then look at the graph, okay? But before we read a graph, of course, we want to look at the title. It says optimal temperature ranges for 4 fish species. We have the type of fish here on the y-axis: lake trout, largemouth bass, sunfish, and bullhead. And here you see that temperature going in degrees of 5 degrees Celsius. Okay, now let's look at our answer choices. Is there going to be competition for a temperature range of 5 degrees to 10 degrees? Well, the only fish that likes that temperature range is the lake trout. He's not going to be competing with the other fish. If we go to answer choice B, 10 degrees Celsius to 15, you don't have any fish occupying that temperature range. Let's go to C, where we have 15 degree to 20 degree temperature range. So really the only fish occupying that area would be the largemouth bass. So our last answer choice will probably be the best, from 25 degrees Celsius to 30. So in the range of 25 to 30, you see the bullheads occupying that area, as well as some of the sunfish, as well as the largemouth bass. So D would be your best answer choice. We are going to look at a case study on the invasive water hyacinth plant. I'm going to click on the link, play a video, and also read, and we'll talk about the environmental change and then the effects of change on organisms and traits in subsequent populations. So, the water hyacinth is an invasive plant species introduced in Florida. It degrades water quality by blocking photosynthesis, which greatly reduces oxygen levels in the water. This creates a cascading effect by reducing other underwater life, such as fish and other plants. The water hyacinth also reduces biological diversity, impacts native submerged plants, alters immersed plant communities by pushing away and crushing them, and also alters animal communities by blocking access to the water and or eliminating plants the animals depend on for shelter and nesting.
Water hyacinth. This South American native aquatic plant is not hard to recognize. It grows about 3 feet tall and sports luscious lavender blooms with a distinctive yellow spot on just one of its 6 petals. Although it is beautiful, the crimes that this aquatic plant has committed are so great that it should be locked away forever. If only that worked. Water hyacinth forms dense, sprawling mats on the water's surface that even boats have a hard time penetrating. Those mats become islands of their own, providing the perfect environment for other semi-aquatic plants and grasses to sprout. It is freakishly prolific, doubling its population every 2 weeks. Because of that, it's gone on a crime spree in Asia, Australia, and the Americas and other parts of Africa. This plant ranks as one of the world's worst aquatic weeds.
Okay, so the environmental change here is that the water hyacinth is an invasive species. It takes up the pond or the water that it's in. So what is the effect of change on organisms? Well, other plants cannot photosynthesize. It blocks the light for other plants to reproduce. So pretty much other organisms, other plant species are going to die out. They'll become extinct because the hyacinth takes over. Okay, there aren't many species that can adapt to this environmental change. Also, you see that it's also taking up the space. So competition here would be in space as well. Okay. Okay, looking at another case study, we're going to look at deforestation and the loss of species. So deforestation. Forests are complex ecosystems that are important to carbon and water cycles that sustain life on Earth. When they're degraded, it can set off a devastating change of events, both locally and around the world. 70% of the world's plants and animals live in forests and are losing their habitat to deforestation. Loss of habitat can lead to species extinction. This is not only a biodiversity tragedy, but also has negative consequences for medical research and local populations who rely on the animals and plants in the forest for hunting and medicine.
Camilla Arredondo, if you're on campus, please come to the front office. Camilla Arredondo, if you're on campus, please come to
Forests
the front
cover
office.
about 30% of the planet, and the ecosystems they create play an essential role in supporting life on Earth. But deforestation is clearing Earth's forests on a massive scale, and at the current rate of destruction, the world's rainforests could completely disappear within 100 years. Why should we care about deforestation? Together, forestry and agriculture are responsible for 24% of greenhouse gas emissions, making deforestation a significant contributor to climate change. Deforestation impacts the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere in two ways. First, when trees are felled, they release the carbon they are storing into the atmosphere. Second, trees play a critical role in absorbing the greenhouse gases that fuel global warming. Fewer forests mean larger amounts of greenhouse gases entering the atmosphere, and increased speed and severity of global warming. In addition to helping regulate the Earth's climate, forests provide habitats for over 80% of the plants and animals that live on land. But deforestation destroys these habitats, diminishing biodiversity. Some estimate that 4,000 to 6,000 rainforest species go extinct each year. This also affects the more than 2 billion people who rely on forests as sources of food and shelter. The biggest driver of deforestation is agriculture. Farmers chop down trees in order to plant crops like soybeans, palm trees, and cocoa, or to make room to raise livestock for beef. Logging operations, which provide the world's wood and paper products, also cut countless trees each year. Forests are also destroyed as a result of growing urban sprawl as land is developed for dwellings. The effects of deforestation are grave, but not irreversible. Efforts such as managing forest resources, eliminating clear-cutting, and planting new trees to replace those removed are already being made to reduce deforestation's environmental impact on our planet. And while some plant and animal species are gone forever, combating deforestation can help prevent further loss of biodiversity.
Okay, so here our environmental change is deforestation. Okay, and what happens? What's the effect of change on organisms? Well, when you cut down trees, trees provide, they reduce carbon emissions in our atmosphere. So what's going to happen here is global warming is going to happen where you have climate fluctuations due to deforestation. So this is going to affect a lot of organisms and traits in subsequent populations if they have climate fluctuations like global warming. Our next case study is Arctic warming.
This could be the warmest year on record, and this is what it looks like in one of the coldest places on Earth. The Arctic summer has come to an end, yet there's no snow on the ground. Instead, the night before it rained, and the temperature is several degrees above the sub-freezing average for early autumn. Of course, that's just weather. It varies all the time. But there's a rumble, like distant thunder, that speaks of a more profound change. The sound echoes around Ny-Ålesund, one of the world's most northerly research outposts. If you travel from there a few miles up the fjord, you reach the icebergs that are carving off the front of the Kronbreen Glacier. Glaciers carve like this every season, but this year's high temperatures mean it's more active than anyone can remember. The wall of ice is as tall as a block of flats, and we've been told to stay back because of flying boulders of ice. We just saw another huge piece of this glacier, which is quite literally melting before our very eyes. That thunderous crash is an absolutely enormous piece of ice carving off the front of this glacier. Our guide is Kim Holme of the Norwegian Polar Institute. He's carrying a flare gun and rifle to ward off polar bears. If they don't work, his trademark hat, knitted by a grateful student, might do the trick.
The landscape is very different from what it used to be. It is extremely active and at the same time serene, so it's a fascinating place. I notice in springtime that the snow melts earlier. I notice the warm air we're standing in right now. So wherever I look, there is very obvious change that I have experienced myself.
We're carefully picking our way over the ice and mud. It's dangerous going. The melting glacier can leave deep voids beneath the ground.
Where we stand right now, right at the fringe of the glacier, used to be a nice solid glacier. And across the fjord there, the hill you see, we used to have picnics on top of that little mound and watch the calving which was happening right beside us.
It's less of a picnic spot now, just slabs of ice left behind by the glacier, surrounded by a muddy moraine. Best estimates are that the ice has retreated a kilometre in less than a decade. Each time another chunk carves off the glacier, this one the size of a house, it sends waves breaking across the otherwise still fjord. All the ice in the sea around us has fallen off the glacier in these warmer months. But in winter, this entire fjord typically froze over with ice a metre thick. But for the last few years, it hasn't frozen at all. On average, Svalbard used to be surrounded by sea ice during the long Arctic winter. But for years, the sea ice has been in retreat, and this winter, it reached the lowest level in the satellite record, leaving the islands almost completely free of ice year-round. So these stripes you can see in this iceberg are a year in the life of the glacier that it came from. It's amazing to think how much of the Arctic's history is just melting away here. And those cracking noises you can hear are air bubbles popping out of the ice, some of which have been trapped there for 800 years or more. Arctic ice reflects the sun's energy back into space, so the more ice that's lost, the warmer the Arctic Ocean becomes. It's a vicious circle that could raise sea levels and melt Arctic permafrost, causing more warming still. What happens in the Arctic doesn't necessarily stay in the Arctic. Some scientists have claimed links between the UK's severe winter storms of 2014 and warming at the pole. The extreme cold snap and snow in the North American polar vortex of the same year was also linked to warmer Arctic weather. The scientific consensus is that if we continue as we are, there will be no summer sea ice in the Arctic around 30 years from now. Melting has changed the geopolitics of the North, opening it up to tourism, shipping, fishing, and oil. But in places like Svalbard, there's a whole ecosystem of creatures that depend on ice to survive.
These species, fish, birds, plants, have nowhere to go. There is no land north of us, and which means that we're at the terminus and we are losing some species.
Next month, 190 countries meet in Marrakesh to haggle over how to implement last year's Paris climate deal. Its ambitious target is to keep global warming below 2 degrees. It will help, but it's nowhere near enough to stop the Arctic getting warmer still. However fast we act, it's time to come to terms with a new North.
So with Arctic warming, with a warming Arctic comes an early spring and a proliferation of parasitic insects such as flies and mosquitoes. For Arctic dwellers from caribou to guillemots, a population explosion of insects is at best a nuisance and at worst life-threatening. Grazers that spend less energy feeding and more energy just trying to escape these pests. Arctic nesting, brunches, guillemots in Canada have been such victims of relentless mosquito attack that they have been observed abandoning their nests. A changed season for insects also had a different effect on some species of birds, which timed their migrations to coincide with insect swells. Northern Alaska dunlins, for an example, migrate from Asia and lay their eggs to take advantage of peak insect populations in order to feed their young. Warmer temperatures may cause the insects to hatch earlier, throwing off the carefully timed breeding and nesting seasons of the dunlins. So here, your environmental change was Arctic warming. The effects here, you're having those climate fluctuations again, which you saw organisms, species either die or migrate. This also changes the feeding habits of organisms as well. So you can go back to the article or the video and fill in the remaining information. Now we're going to look at a pine forest, and we're going to see how long-term environmental changes affect organisms and traits in subsequent populations. So a group of scientists studied some trees in a pine forest. In a densely forested areas, the trees were within 1 meter of each other. The scientists observed that these trees had dead branches near the ground. They measured the height above the ground at which the first living branches were found on different sized trees in the forest. They then repeated the procedure on some kind of trees and the same kind of trees in an open meadow. So the graph here summarizes the scientists' data. So what you look here, you can see that the title are living branch height in pine trees. And here on your x-axis, you have trees in a dense forest compared to trees in an open meadow. So the height of the living branches increases from bottom to top on the y-axis. So you can see that the trees in the dense forests are not growing as much as the ones in an open meadow where they're receiving more sunlight. Okay, so their heights are increasing. So identify 2 possible abiotic factors in which these trees compete. So here the trees are competing for sunlight and space. Based on evidence, what inference can be made about this data? So you can see that trees in open meadows are getting more sunlight, so they're growing taller than the trees in the dense forest. Bark beetles are among the more common boring insects detected in a declining pine tree in urban and rural areas. Symptoms include holes as thick as a pencil leading along the main trunk or major limbs. Although there are many bark beetles in our region, their life cycles are similar. Once beneath the bark, adults lay eggs that hatch into small grubs that bore beneath the bark. Grubs eventually hatch into adults that reinfest the declining trees. Often, more than 100 beetles per square foot on bark can emerge from declining trees, carrying a blue stained fungus that attacks the plant's vascular system. This fungus can be passed to new trees when they're attacked by the adult bark beetles. Bark beetles on evergreens have several generations of adults that fly from mid-April through mid-September. So what effect would you expect the bark beetles to have on a population of pine trees in the forest over time? And would this impact be considered a short-term or a long-term change? Explain. Okay, so the effect that you would expect on bark beetles to have on a population of pine trees in the forest over time could be detrimental because they are affecting the pine trees, and pine trees' vascular systems are going to get attacked. So perhaps you can see a decline in the pine tree population over time, and you'd see an increase in this bark beetle. Okay, this would be a long-term change. This does not happen immediately. It's going to happen slowly over time.